as a last thing, as kind of a promotion to say, here's the book and here's where you
Yes.
can buy it.
And once again, the book is From Darkness to Light.
Yeah.
And Sean, we will share that link, the Amazon link here on the Zoom side and on the Facebook and YouTube side. Hello, Facebook. Hello, YouTube.
Hello.
We're looking forward to tonight's VBC, A Veteran Story with Pete Mecca. And we're about ready. In fact, we are ready. Sean, why don't you let people in and I'll start the music.
Good.
Everybody, and welcome to our Veterans Breakfast Club, A Veteran Story with Pete Mecca, starring Pete Mecca. I am not Pete Mecca. I'm Todd DiPastino, and I'm the executive director of the Veterans Breakfast Club, which is a nonprofit that began here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I am. And last year we started doing online programs like this, and our goal really is to share veteran stories and stories of survivors of war with the public and have a lively interaction with the public. And we do that in events like this online and also in person, usually a couple times a week, sometimes more than that, always Monday nights with our VBC happy hour at 7 p.m. and at least once a month with Pete Mecca, who has his own radio program and his own wonderful website of veteran stories. He's a veteran himself. Pete, how are you?
I'm still kicking after all these years, Todd. How about yourself?
Very good. And it's a beautiful evening here in Pittsburgh. What is it like in St. Augustine, Florida?
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
Very good.
3 inches of water in the backyard, but we're fine.
Yeah, that sounds like that's pretty standard lately in Florida.
Swampland.
Yeah. Swampland.
Swamps down here. It's not in DC.
We also have Sean Hall. Hello, Sean. How are you? He's our program director.
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. Very good. So I'm going to throw it to you, Pete, and thank you so much for lining up these fascinating veteran stories. And I'm looking forward to tonight's program very much.
Okay. Thank you, Todd. Folks, we're going to jump right into this. Imagine it's 1942. You're a 4-year-old child in Budapest, Hungary, when your father is constricted into a Jewish labor battalion. You never see your father again. In 1944, your mother is taken away. She survives the horrors of a concentration camp, but is so weak, someone has to bring her home in a wheelbarrow. You run back into the house because you believe there is no way the flesh and bone human in the wheelbarrow could be your mother. Thus was just 2 episodes in the young life of Holocaust survivor Robert Bob Ratonyi during World War II. 75 years after the end of World War II, the remaining number of Holocaust survivors is now very small, and most of those are very elderly, into their 90s or even into their hundreds. Alana Bob Ratonyi is among the younger survivors at age 83. He has written a book about his experiences called From Darkness into Light that describes his gripping journeys through Nazism, fascism, communism, and into freedom. Bob, my friend, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you, Pete. I hope you can hear me well. If not, let me know. Before I start, I want to tell you that my book is a large book. It's 335 pages. And what you will hear today is approximately 5% of the total word count of the book. So please excuse me for just hitting the highlights. I will do my best to fill in the gaps in my stories during the Q&A period.
You'll do fine. Bob, your book fits the generic category of a biography, but your title, subtitle, and graphic design suggest to the reader much more than that. Can you tell us about this briefly?
My book is not just a memoir of the first 26 years of my life. It is also a narrative of historic events in the middle of the 20th century: World War II, the Holocaust, the Cold War against the hardcore Stalinist communist dictatorship, a bloody uprising in Hungary in 1956, and my subsequent escape through the Iron Curtain to freedom. And finally, since America is an immigrant nation, I wanted to describe life as an immigrant in the free world.
Okay. Could you tell us more about your motivations to write this book?
Well, the truth is, I never intended to write or publish a book. After my second grandson was born here in Atlanta in 2002, I wanted to write down a few important and interesting stories for two reasons. First, to acquaint my grandchildren with their Jewish Hungarian roots, and second, through 5 stories, which I call journeys, I wanted to pass on to them the important conclusions I reached and the lessons I learned in my early life. Publishing my stories in a book is the unintended consequences of first becoming a public speaker in 2011, 10 years ago, about my first journey, the Holocaust. Students and adults who heard my story wanted to know how a 7-year-old child survivor of the war and the Holocaust ended up in America and became a successful professional. I was frequently asked if I published my stories, and my answer was always no. It was only 2 years ago I decided to publish my stories after I convinced myself that there is a demand for it.
All right. Well, how did an engineer trained successful business executive like yourself become a public speaker, delivering thousands of talks on the Holocaust 60 years after the events?
Well, this transformation or new career came about when a close friend of mine, a member of the Atlanta Northside Baptist Church, learned about my Holocaust story. We worked together for many years. We socialized. He knew how old I was. He knew that I was Jewish and that I was from Hungary. But he never put 2 and 2 together and figured out that I was a World War II and a child Holocaust survivor. He wanted to read my story when I wrote it years before that. And then after he read it, he asked me to speak to his church members in 2010. Because of that speech, the word got around in the Atlanta Jewish community that I was a child Holocaust survivor. And since then, I have spoken to thousands of students and many adult groups on behalf of the Georgia Commission on the Holocaust, the Bremen Holocaust Museum, educational institutions, and civic organizations like your World War II Roundtable. So that is how my new career as a public speaker developed during the last 10 years.
Well, let me ask you this. How was the experience writing your book different from talking to a live audience? I mean, did you find it liberating or exhausting or both?
It's a good question. Writing my 5 stories first, in not necessarily chronological order, and then seamlessly integrating them into a book was a challenge both physically and emotionally. I traveled extensively around the world to interview the then living family members in Australia, in England, in Hungary, in Israel, and in Canada. I also did extensive research for my stories to provide an accurate historic context for them. Writing was also a cathartic experience because in my family, all of them survivors, we never spoke about the Holocaust. It was like taboo. And I never confronted myself with any of my deep-seated emotions that were locked away in my subconscious mind. Speaking, particularly about the Holocaust, was, and honestly still is, emotionally difficult because I discovered over these years that the wounds of the Holocaust never heal. The experiences and the images I've frozen in my mind, and I'm afraid that I will carry them to the end of my days.
We're going to discuss your 5 journeys from your book, Bob. First, we're going to discuss a Holocaust childhood. The Holocaust had devastating effects on you and your family. However, as your book attests, the hardship of being Jewish in Hungary started in 1938, before World War II. How did anti-Semitism affect you and your family prior to the German invasion of Hungary in March of 1944?
Well, anti-Semitism existed in Hungary long before I was born. The first European anti-Semitic law in the 20th century was passed by the Hungarian parliament in 1920. It was called numerus clausus, 2 Latin words meaning closed number. It limited the number of Jewish students who would enter into the university to 6%. Now, there may be debates about when the Holocaust started, but my personal opinion is that the Holocaust started in November 1938, the year I was born, with the events of Kristallnacht, or the Nights of Broken Glass. This event took place in the Third Reich after Germany annexed Austria in the spring of 1938. There are 2 lasting personal impacts I will tell you about. Kristallnacht was an organized riot against the Jews in Germany and Austria. Hundreds of synagogues were burned, thousands of Jewish businesses were destroyed, and approximately 30,000 Jews were deported to the Dachau Nazi concentration camp that already existed. The worst atrocities took place in Berlin, the capital of Germany, and Vienna, the capital of Austria, that is only 125 miles from Budapest, where I was born. The news of these events reached Budapest within days, if not hours. And these events determined that I shall become a single child, something I always regretted. I was 60 years old when I learned that my father forbade my mother to have any more children, telling her that, and I'm going to quote what she told me, "We cannot bring another Jewish child into this world," end of quote. In retrospect, my father was right, because I barely survived as a 6-year-old child. Also, in 1942, when I was 4 years old, my father was conscripted into a Jewish labor battalion, and I never saw him again. He died in a concentration camp in Austria in January 1945, just before the camp was liberated. I don't know if you have my family picture handy, if you could show it on the screen, but I only have one picture where the 3 of us together, and that's the only and the last family picture.
There it is.
That's the one. Thank you. Go ahead, Pete.
1942. You're a cute little kid there, Bob.
Yes, I don't know what happened 80 years later.
Okay, now by 1944, you were 6 years old, which made it mandatory for you to wear the yellow star to identify you as Jewish. Tell us about your memories of the experiences of 1945 and what it meant for you as a child.
1944 was the year when the Holocaust, or the final solution, which was the official German name, actually was the final solution of the Jewish question. Hungary was an ally of Germany since 1940, but Hitler was unhappy with Hungary's support of the war. And in March of 1944, Germany invaded Hungary. Immediately, new anti-Semitic laws were passed. One of those laws were that all Jews 6 years and older had to wear a yellow star in public. As a 6-year-old child, I didn't understand the significance of wearing a yellow star. My mother didn't explain to me why I had to wear it. when I went out to the street in front of our building and played with my Christian friends, or why she had to wear one when she went out shopping. Our naivety as children is best illustrated by my childhood friend, Jewish friend Andy. He was not yet 6 years old in March of 1944. He told his mother that he wanted to wear a yellow star just like I did. But his mother refused to sew one on his coat. Well, Andy, I remember, actually my mother remembered it more than I do, that he cried bitterly because neither of us understood that the yellow star made the difference between life and death in the ensuing months. The very first time that I suspected that something terribly wrong might be happening was when my mother took me to see the pastor of the local Protestant church that was just around the corner from where we lived. She asked him if he could convert me and provide proof of my being a Christian. The answer was no. There were strict laws against converting Jews, and the penalty for breaking the laws were severe: deportation and almost certain death. It was in the late spring and early summer of 1944 when phase one of the final solution in Hungary was implemented. With lightning speed and great efficiency, approximately 500,000 Jewish men, women, and children that represented about 75% of the Hungarian Jewry. These people who lived outside of the capital city of Budapest were dragged from their homes, jammed into cattle cars, and deported out of Hungary. And I had a very large family, 10 children on my mother's side and 9 on my father's side. Members from both sides of my family, uncles and aunts and cousins, were included in that number. About 450,000, or 90% of the Hungarian Jews from the provinces and smaller cities, were sent to Auschwitz. And of those, only 10% survived.
Wow.
It took less than 60 days from March 15 to July 9 of 1944 to accomplish this. Now, it just so happens, as you're looking at this map, that Auschwitz is the closest death camp to Budapest. I think it's about 345 miles. Then, the summer of 1944 brought other horrors to all of us living in Budapest. The Allies landed in Normandy, and the Battle of Europe began. The American bombers came during the day and the British at night. The whistling sound of the bombs falling and the explosion that followed were frightening. We had to scurry down to the cellar under a two-story part of our building when the siren went on. At one time, a bomb hit our building right above the cellar, but luckily it didn't explode. It got lodged between the floor of the second floor apartment and the ceiling of the first floor apartment.
Wow.
The bomb was about as big as I was. So my mother struggled to keep us fed. Remember, my father was gone for almost 2 years, and I was constantly hungry. Food was scarce because the farmers couldn't bring food into the city because of the war. And many shops refused to sell food to Jews who were easily identified because of the yellow star. The worst physical and emotional experience happened to me was on October 10, 1945, in the early dawn while we slept. We were waken up by soldiers banging on our door and ordering us to get dressed and line up in the courtyard and join the other Jewish women and children. And then the women were marched off and I was left alone by myself. I was scared, not knowing what will happen to me. Luckily, a good friend of my mother, an older lady called Julia, found me in the morning and told me to put my clothing into a bag and said that she will take me to my grandparents' place in the center of Budapest. And from this point on, I was with my grandparents, my 2 aunts, and my 3 older cousins. How we survived is a miracle, and I have to thank a number of heroes who helped us. This includes Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat who issued thousands of Schutzpasses or safe passes to save Jews. And my 14-year-old cousin, Mike, whose job was to go out without his yellow star and find anything valuable in the destroyed buildings and houses, and then barter them for food that we had to live on. In October 1944, the virulently anti-Semitic party called the Arrow Cross Party were put in charge by the Germans to finish the final solution for the remaining Jews of Budapest. Random killings of Jews started, and the big ghetto was formed to herd all the Jews there prior to deportation. Eventually, we ended up in the Budapest big ghetto around December 1945. That was safer than being in a Swedish protected house where we were trying to hide out with fake Schutzpasses, I should say. The ghetto was protected by a 10 feet tall fence that surrounded some 25 blocks of buildings where 70,000 Jews were herded to be deported. I don't know if there's a picture of the ghetto. I don't know if you already showed it or not. That shows you, gives you, it's a top view of the big ghetto of Budapest. And it was right in the middle of the center of the city. Technically, the Arrow Cross was not allowed to come into the ghetto and drag Jews out of the ghetto and kill them, because the ghetto was walled off. There were only 4 gates, and they were guarded by soldiers. But of course, the soldiers could be bribed, and occasionally, every night, Arrow Cross would come in and grab some of the Jews from the ghetto, take them out, and dump them into the frozen Danube. We were liberated by the Red Army of the Soviet Union on January 8, 1945, exactly a week after I turned 7. By this time, I was too weak to get up on my feet because of malnutrition. I reunited with my mother in the summer of 1945, and many months later, I learned that my father will never return. I'll stop here, Pete, and let you go on with your questions.
Wow. I'm sure that the folks will have some questions about the Holocaust later, but the second part of your journey, Bob, was growing up under communism. You went from Nazism to communism. Describe how life was for you growing up in a working class family under communism.
The Communist Party took total control of Hungary in 1948. It took only 3 years to go from a fairly, relatively free parliamentary system, and the first election was held in 1945, and the Communist Party had about 10% of the vote. By 1948, the last election that was held, the Communists had 90% of the vote. So it only took them 3 years to assassinate all the opponents and undermine the other parties, and leaders of parties disappeared. It was a typical way of the communists to handle the system. The means justify the end. And as an adolescent, I was brainwashed with consistent propaganda about the, quote, exploitation of workers in the imperialist and capitalist West, end of quote, and the wonderful future of the working class under socialism and communism. That's how I grew up. That was the propaganda. It was many years later that I discovered a brilliant statement by Winston Churchill that I like to quote. He said at a White House luncheon in 1954, quote, "The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries." My mother and I shared those miseries. I grew up in very poor circumstances, way below what we define today as in the US as the poverty line. Without a father, my mother had to work as a manual laborer since she only had 8 years of schooling and no special skills. We had meat once a week, rarely had butter or eggs, and lived in a 2-room tiny apartment with no indoor plumbing. I never had a bicycle or a soccer ball to kick around. My mother never had enough money to make ends meet from paycheck to paycheck, and she constantly had to borrow from her best friend. We lived in, as I said, in a tiny two-room apartment. The whole space was, I think, smaller than my current living room. To take a bath was a complex procedure. First, I had to go to the cellar to bring some wood up to start up the kitchen stove. Then I had to heat up a big pot of water to pour into a 3 feet wide basin that was kept under the kitchen table. That was the process to wash yourself. You have read this chapter of the book. You really have to read this chapter of the book to get a true understanding of life under a totalitarian and communist dictatorship. We just don't have enough time for me to tell you all about it.
Well, despite the tragedies you faced as a child, you describe your childhood as a happy one. What do you attribute to that happiness?
Well, because my parents came from very large families, I had enough uncles and aunts and survived the Holocaust to provide a loving family environment for me as I grew up, since I was the only orphan in the family without a father. In addition, I had my mother's unconditional love, and I could see the many sacrifices she made to make my life easier. I was a very social boy, made friends easily. I participated in all kinds of sports activities. Perhaps the only good thing I can say about the communist system is that they subsidized all sports and arts. It was almost free to attend the theater, the opera, or the symphony, and my mother encouraged me to take advantage of these opportunities. And finally, and most importantly, I always had a positive outlook toward the future, regardless of our economic circumstances. I never felt victimhood or had a chip on my shoulder. Everyone around me told me that I was smart, and if I study, I will become an engineer. And I believed it. So that's the secret.
Okay. Of all the influential characters you described in your book, if you had to choose two who had the most effect on you, who would that be?
Well, the first one would be my mother's older brother, Uncle Lotzi, a Holocaust survivor who became my role model. He provided the much needed guidance during my teenage years. He chastised me when I got into trouble, constantly reminded me of my responsibilities to help my mother, and instilled in me an unquestionable desire to become an educated man. One of his favorite sayings was, and I quote, "Robert, always remember that they can take everything away from you, but not your education." End of quote. He never defined what he meant by, quote, they, but I instinctively understood it. He also taught me to be a decent man. He urged me to be both sensible and sensitive, something I only understood much, much later in life. The second influential person was Rabbi Kalman at our local synagogue. He wrote a letter to me as his present for my bar mitzvah, which had 3 advices for me. His words made a great influence on me as I grew up and later on. Remember, this was in 1951 when I was 13 years old, only 6 years after the Holocaust. Here it is, my English translation of his letter. I like to just grab my book and quote it for you of what he told me. My first advice, he said, try to recover from the wounds inflicted on you. Do not brood over the past. Become a man of sound mind, sound heart, and strong will and action. Your challenge will be hard to accomplish this. Listen to my second advice for the road you will travel. Depend on yourself to make up for what the mad devastation of which the evil years deprived you, the father and his advice. Depend on yourself to harden your own character, to develop your own principles, to enjoy work, and to brace against life's inevitable disappointment. My third advice, trust yourself. You grew up in front of me. I know you to be more responsible than many grown-ups. I have known you for years and we liked each other. Look at me. Promise me that you will always be a truly good man, an affectionate son of your self-sacrificing mother, and a devoted student of the ancient Torah. May its blessings follow your life. This was January 11, 1951. And this letter was my only bar mitzvah present.
That's the best advice I've ever heard. Bob, in 1956, that's when you changed your name from Reichman to Ratonyi. What motivated you to do so, and what were the short-term and long-term consequences?
It's a great question, Pete. Let me explain. Just before my graduation from high school, the Hungarian government issued a proclamation to encourage people to Hungarianize their foreign names. There were lots of foreign names in Hungary, a lot of Slavic names, a lot of German names, and others. Virtually all Hungarians with German names were Jews. In anti-Semitic Hungary, it was easy to pick out a Jew just by his or her last name. After graduation from high school, I wanted to blend into my new society at the university without letting everyone know that I'm a Jew before people could even get to know me. I consulted with my mother and she didn't object to changing my name. But there was another reason I wanted to change my name, and that is because the Hungarian language is a phonetic language and nobody could spell my German name right. I always had to spell it out, Reichmann. Changing my name to Ratonyi, a well-known Hungarian name, I thought, will result in never having to spell my name again. Now, the short-term consequences of changing my name came 6 months later when I escaped to Austria, where they speak German, and nobody could spell my new name, Ratonyi. The Austrian border guard who was registering us refugees after we crossed the border asked for my name, and when I said Ratonyi, he looked up and asked, "How do you spell it?" So the long-term consequences of Hungarianizing my name came in Canada and in the US, where nobody could spell or say Ratonyi with the accent on the first syllable, which is true in Hungarian and every word. It is always mispronounced as Ratonyi. Therefore, most people think that I'm Italian. So that's my explanation.
That's a great explanation. We're going to move to Journey 3, the Hungarian Uprising of 1956. Let's discuss that uprising. What was it like for you as a young college student to find yourself caught up in the middle of an uprising which quickly turned violent?
First, it was a thrilling to have a taste of freedom when the uprising broke out on October 23rd, 1956, led by students in my university. Tens of thousands of students from several universities in Budapest marched to the statue of a Polish general of the 1848 revolution that swept across Europe. We peacefully marched and handed out a sheet of paper with 16 demands for reforming the communist system and demanding the withdrawal of Russian forces from Hungary. We marched and sang patriotic Hungarian songs that were forbidden by the government. By late afternoon and evening, the crowd grew to over 100,000 people, and we marched to the parliament and to the radio station to declare our demand over public radio. I have never experienced such feelings of freedom and elation. I still remember it. Because we lived in the outskirts of Budapest, I had to take the last streetcar from Parliament around 10 o'clock in the evening, knowing full well that my mother was worried that I didn't show up at home at the usual time. I was excited to tell my mother what happened in the city, and I went to bed happily thinking of going back to the university next day. That actually never happened. And that is how I missed the shooting when the shooting started, and how our peaceful march turned into a bloody riot. The following day, on October 24, I discovered what happened, and a full-blown nationwide uprising was in process. And before I knew it, I had a gun in my hand. I frightened my mother when I showed up with a gun at home. I did not think of her feelings and her shock at seeing me with a gun. It was only 12 years earlier when she was taken away at gunpoint from the very same apartment, and I felt ashamed. The student demands for freedom from the Russian oppression were clear to me, although some of the other demands I didn't fully understand. Then I witnessed the hatred of the mob, lynching and burning the bodies of the enemy, the occupying Russian soldiers, and the secret police that represented the iron fist of the communist leadership of the country. I saw again what I witnessed as a 6-year-old child during the Holocaust: men's inhumanity against other men. It was sobering and made me question my own humanity. I learned then that revolutions are messy affairs, and they leave a dark shadow over your head and confusion of what is right and what is wrong. The Hungarian uprising ended up in defeat. The Russians were first caught off guard and had to leave the country, and Hungary became a free country for about 4 weeks. I felt that I had a patriotic duty to join the revolutionaries to protect our country from the anticipated attack and reoccupation by the Russians, which did take place in middle to late November. We were all naive, expecting American paratroopers to drop down from the sky, but it didn't happen. Much later, I understood that President Eisenhower was preoccupied with the Suez Canal crisis. Oil, as I later learned in America, always had priority over human rights.
Wow. Journey 4, the escape from Hungary after the Russians crushed the uprising in November of 1956. In hindsight, what do you think were the main reasons behind this life-changing decision, and was it for practical reasons or psychological, Bob?
Well, my first reason to escape was the fear of retribution. I signed my name in a book when I picked up a gun at the local police station, and I feared for my safety and my life. The radio announced amnesty for all the students who participated in the uprising, but I didn't believe it. I did not want to end up in jail or in a Siberian gulag. Another reason to leave was the desire to live in a free society, something I have heard of through the Voice of America and read about it in books, but never experienced it. Also, I must admit, it sounded like an interesting venture for an 18-year-old boy. And finally, I heard that 2 of my lifelong friends that I grew up with successfully escaped. So I discussed the idea with my mother, and we agreed that I will try to escape first, and then she will follow me, perhaps using a paid guide. I did not know that I will not see her again until 7 years later, in 1963, when I got married to my wife, Eva, in Montreal, Canada. Once I decided to escape, I went to see one of my close friends, Bill Fodor, and asked him if he wants to join me. He immediately agreed, and we decided to cross the border to Austria in the middle of the night on a fairly arbitrary date we picked, December 6, 1956. Time was of the essence, since the border between Hungary and Austria was already being closed. The watchtowers with searchlights were manned again, and the mines along the border were still there. So we made our plan and actually succeeded, but never imagined the difficulties we would run into in executing our plan.
Tell me how difficult it was to plan for and execute crossing the border to Austria.
Well, Bill and I knew the dangers we faced, but we had a simple plan to get us across the border. We both were players in the junior handball team sponsored by the Locomotive Association of Hungary. Now, handball is not very popular in America, and most people don't even know what it is. It's a little bit like a cross between soccer and basketball, and it's between two teams. In 1956, the national championship of handball championships were played in a city called Győr, the largest city in Western Hungary, about 50 miles from the Austrian border that summer. We met at that time, we met the Győr train station master during this tournament. And our plan was to find this guy once we get to Győr and ask him to tell us the safest way to cross the border. We actually did that. We went from Budapest to Győr on a train one early morning, and he welcomed us, and he was very kind to help. Little did we know at the time that he was part of a well-organized human smuggling operation that we fell into. The first surprise came in the dawn hours before we got going. The first surprise, the biggest surprise, came to us in the dawn hours of December 6th, when Bill and I supposed to arrive at, Bill was supposed to arrive at our house with his friend who had a pickup truck, and he was going to take us to the train station. And to my great surprise, 5 other people gathered in front of our building to join Bill and me. Polly was another 18-year-old boy, some distant relative of Bill. Then there was my friend Gabi's stepmother with her 8-year-old son. By the way, Gabi was my oldest friend who previously escaped. And there were 2 young women in their 20s. I was shocked to learn that our, quote, secret plan to escape was not so secret, thanks to my and Bill's mother. The mother with her son and the 2 single women were seeking protection from us, 2 teenagers, to lead them across the dangerous border. And now, instead of just the 2 of us, there were 7 of us to make the dangerous trip. Bill and I were prepared for running across some Russians at the border, or perhaps Hungarian soldiers, and each of us had a bottle of vodka and a carton of cigarettes in our briefcase, in addition to our toothbrush and a change of shirts and underwear. When I wrote this story down, I started thinking about it, how ironic it was that the 3 young women that we were supposed to care for were better equipped to bargain with the Russians or Hungarian border guards than we were with our vodka and cigarettes, with very little money in our pocket. But eventually, we all made it across the border around the middle of the night on December 6th. But our story supports the saying that truth is stranger than fiction. You actually have to read the story to appreciate what happened to us.
Oh my goodness. I have a few questions about your last and final journey, what you call number 5, your immigrant years. After you escaped from Hungary, how difficult was it for you to find a new home in a new country? And what were your options in terms of immigration? And how did you end up as a US citizen?
In Hungary, I learned a lot about America through the Voice of America radio and Radio Free Europe. So this was the first destination for us when we got to Vienna. Probably a week or 2 weeks after we crossed the border. Unfortunately, by the time Bill and I got to the American embassy in late 1956, the quota for Hungarian refugees was filled. I also went to the Israeli embassy, where they were recruiting young Jewish boys. First, they did not want to believe that I was Jewish because of my Austrian refugee paper had a stamp that had the word Catholic on it. I threatened to drop my pants to prove that I'm Jewish, and they finally agreed to talk to me. They promised full tuition at the Technion, one of Israel's best technical universities. But first, I would have to spend 6 months learning Hebrew, and then I had to serve 2 years in the Israeli Defense Forces before attending university. I did not like the deal. and I didn't want to leave Bill behind, who had no reason to go to Israel as a Catholic boy. We found out that 3 other countries were actually recruiting students: Austria, Sweden, and Canada. We struck Austria off the list rather quickly when we heard that there were not enough women living in Austria. Now you have to remember, we were 18 years old, healthy boys full of testosterone. So girls were always on our mind. Sweden looked attractive because we knew they had beautiful blonde women there. Unfortunately, the Swedes wanted us to sign a 10-year contract to work in Sweden after graduating from college. This quid pro quo did not appeal to us, so Sweden was struck off our list. And that is how Bill and I ended up as immigrants in Canada in February 1957.
How did you end up in the United States?
Well, that's an interesting story. And that's really the very, very first story or sub-story that I wrote. Let me tell you what happened. This is how I ended up going to MIT. And that's why I ended up coming to the United States.
That's right. You write extensively about MIT. How did you
Yes.
end up there? Go ahead.
Well, a friend of mine, I wrote this story down on how I got to MIT, but I wasn't sure that it was good enough for anything. So I had a very good friend of mine here in Atlanta who worked for Wall Street Journal as a reporter and as an editor for 30 years. And he agreed to proofread my story. And after he read it, he encouraged me to continue. So this is the very first story I wrote, long before I wrote up all the other stories. So let me tell you how it happened. Going to MIT was a purely unintended consequence of events in early 1961. I was about to finish 4 years of evening engineering studies in Montreal, and I was looking forward to transfer to 2 years of daytime study at McGill University in the fall of 1961 to get my engineering degree. McGill promised us loans and tuitions, and it was a sure thing. In the evening school, I met another friend of mine called Peter Chakai, another unpronounceable Hungarian name, and the evening school ed, who was also a Hungarian immigrant. For 4 years, we studied together and helped each other translating the textbooks and homework assignments when our English was still poor, particularly during the first year. Then, out of sheer curiosity, in the spring of 1961, after we finished our evening school, Peter and I asked our physics professor, which are the best engineering universities in the world? His name was Professor Borden. I still remember that. He said, MIT and Caltech, neither of which we ever heard of. But as a bravado, Peter and I decided to invest $10 to send our transcripts to MIT in the spring of '61, and then completely forgot about it. In July, we both received a letter telling us that we were accepted at MIT as juniors. I threw the letter in the wastebasket. I never seriously considered going to MIT. Tuition in 1961 was $750 a semester, and I had $1,000 saved during the last 4 years, sufficient for the next 2 years at McGill University and to get my engineering diploma. But fate intervened again. My future father-in-law was visiting in Montreal from New York, and I told him about the MIT acceptance. He got more excited than I was, for another reason that we could talk about later, and implored me to at least go to MIT and talk to them. He even offered to give Peter and I a ride in his two-door red 1960 Corvair. We had no idea, of course, that Cambridge, Massachusetts, is a 200-mile detour from New York. We've never been in the United States before. But we went and met with the admission officer at MIT, and he assured us that nobody ever left MIT because they couldn't afford it. We were told that we can get a loan and scholarship if we got a 3.5 average for the semester. Let me just finish this story by telling you that this was the most difficult and nerve-wracking 10 hours of train ride back home to Montreal. There was no way we could rationalize the risk of going to MIT and compete with the smartest kids in the world against the assured loan and scholarship to McGill University in Montreal. At the very end, I told Peter, in not so many nice words, the heck with it, let us risk it. And that is how we ended up at MIT.
Fascinating story. Now, your relationship with Ava, your wife, is an inspiring love story. Could you tell us how the two of you met and what made you decide to follow her after years of lost contact?
Well, we met on a blind date in Montreal, probably in 1959. I was working during the day then and went to college at night. I was doing a favor for a friend of mine on a blind date. He needed another buddy because his girlfriend wouldn't go on a date with him unless he brought a friend. So that was okay. But what upset me was after the date that my friend did not share with me the information that my blind date, Eva, was not even 16 years old. At the age of 21, I considered myself to be a mature man, knowing everything, and dating a minor was beneath me. It was not love at first sight, but we started seeing each other, and I surprised her with 16 red roses on her 16th birthday party. Needless to say, this guaranteed immediate acceptance by her parents. I discovered that Eva and I had a lot of common background. She was Jewish and a child Holocaust survivor from Hungary. She was very smart, and our relationship grew as we got to know each other better. Then we got separated in 1961 when she finished her high school in Montreal and followed her parents to the States. And I started studying she went to study at Hunter College in New York City. At the same time, I went to Cambridge to continue my studies at MIT. We saw each other a few times between 1961 and 63 when I finally decided to propose to her when I was in graduate school. I think I came to the conclusion that this is the girl I wanted to spend the rest of my life as a husband, as a friend, and the father of our children. And we just celebrated our 50th anniversary last month.
Oh, congratulations, sir.
Thank you.
I'm just going to conclude with a few questions here, and then we'll open this up. Tell us the messages of your book that you wish to tell your readers.
Yes, this is very important to me that some of these messages get through when I speak to students and when they read my book. I am today, more than a half a century later, the product of those experiences that I describe in my book. I learned some important lessons and drew some conclusions. I learned lessons about the human capacity for love, for kindness, and for self-sacrifice, as well as hate and cruelty during the Holocaust and the Uprising. I also came to the conclusion that there is good and evil in every human heart, and only a thin line that separates those two. I learned the importance of family and having a role model to provide guidance on what is important to grow up and be a responsible, sensible, and sensitive person. I learned that pain and suffering in childhood, or how poor you are growing up, need not have a negative impact on your self-esteem. I learned that socialism and communism are failed utopian ideologies, and history has proven that it always results in misery. not to mention the moral corruption that inevitably results from a totalitarian system. But unfortunately, history repeats itself, and that is why it is important to teach these lessons. We are now in the 21st century, and already there have been several genocides. Open the TV or look at the newspaper, and all you hear about is the battle between socialist and Marxist ideologies against our democratic capitalistic system. I learned the importance of setting goals, taking risks, working hard, and delaying gratification, which I think is very important when you're young, to achieve these goals. I also learned that good luck, being at the right place at the right time, has a lot to do with success. Being an immigrant in Canada and then in the US, I learned how to start out with no material possessions, not even speaking English, and end up as a highly educated, productive member of society in a few years. These are the lessons I hope to pass on to my children, my grandchildren, and future generations of Ratonyis, and now to the general public with the publication of my book.
Bob, you've made many presentations to students over the past 10 years. What was their response?
Let me respond to this question by reading you one of the many, many letters I get from students who listen to my Holocaust story. And this is the letter I'm going to read. It says, "Dear Mr. Robert Ratonyi, thank you so much for taking time out of your day in order to tell our class your childhood story. Your description of the events you experienced while living in Hungary broadened my knowledge to make me more educated. Hearing you to speak was a truly life-changing experience. I came out of that room feeling privileged to be able to live now and where I do. I spoke with my family about your story once I left, and they felt inspired as well. Thank you for feeling open enough with us to let us into this delicate portion of your life. The way you spoke made me remember the gravity to which World War II and the Holocaust changed millions of lives. Thanks to your gift, I will strive to create a better place to live and never stand by during injustice. Thank you so much. With love, Swami Belanki, the Westminster School." This letter was dated January 9, 2018. I think this answers your question, Pete.
Yes, sir, it sure does. It absolutely does. Three quick questions. Your wife is a Holocaust survivor. Is she going to write a book too?
Unfortunately, not. She was just a baby and has no recollection of the Holocaust or the war. But her family's survivor is quite a story. Her father forged ID papers for his family, and she was given away to a Christian family to be saved. Luckily, except for her grandfather, they all survived the Holocaust. Her escape from Hungary, she and her family's escape, when she was 13 years old, is quite a story, matching mine in excitement and danger when they crossed the border to Austria in 1956. But no, she will not write the story.
Sounds like a good book to me.
Will be an excellent one.
All right, let's do it. These are challenging times in America. Are you concerned that there may be a rise in anti-Semitism also?
Definitely, Pete. I lived in America for 60 years and became a citizen 52 years ago. The emergence of open anti-Semitism feels like deja vu, reminding me of what I experienced in Hungary. The rise of anti-Semitism in academia, social media, and in our government. Movements like BLM is frightening to me. I blame the progressive left and the woke generation for trying to destroy our country.
All right. One more question. You've seen what life is like under many forms of government. Give me your thoughts on America and the freedoms we enjoy today.
Great question, Pete. I truly believe that this country is an exceptional country. It is inhabited by the same human beings as any other country. But we have two documents I fell in love with: the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, both aspirational documents that no other country in the world has. As an immigrant, I would have never been able to assimilate fully as a French or German or a British citizen, except for not qualifying for the presidency, something I regret. This is one of the very few immigrant countries where you can reach your goals without cheating, lying, and stealing, something I'm proud of having achieved. I just hope that it is not too late to change the current social, economic, and political trends, and that my grandchildren will enjoy the same freedoms and opportunities that I had over the past 50 years.
Outstanding interview, Bob. Thank you so much. Todd, we want to open this up for questions.
Yeah, I want to invite people who have questions for Bob to ask them on Facebook or here on the Zoom side or on YouTube. I do have one. Did you ever find out the details of your father's death, Bob? Did you do an investigation and research it?
Yes, I did, only because it just so happened that he died in his younger brother's arms in Donnerskirchen, a Jewish labor camp. And he got typhus and became extremely sick. And many times his younger brother had to save him because he was such a high fever that he would go out. This was in the middle of the winter. He would go out, leave the bunker, and just lie in the snow, the freezing snow. And my uncle would bring him back to the cot and try to keep him alive. But the end, he couldn't, and he died there in Donnerskirchen, just a couple of weeks before the camp was liberated by the Allies.
Did your mother ever talk about her experiences in the labor camp?
No, not a word. She never spoke about anything. She lived to be 87 years old, and I lived with her until 1956 when I escaped. And the subject never came up. She never said a word. And nor did any of my surviving uncles or aunts say anything about their experiences. Discussing the Holocaust was like taboo. We just didn't go there.
Right.
So I know nothing. The only thing I know, a little bit, that the only reason she survived in the women's labor camp, also in Austria, is that her best friend from our neighborhood that was with my mother, a very clever, tough, and woman. I got to know her real well. She became the servant of the camp commandant. And because of that, she was able to steal some food and bring it to my mother and kept her alive. And that's the only reason my mother survived.
Wow.
But that's the only thing I know. Also, I don't know if I mentioned it, after my mother was taken away on October 10, 1956, she and thousands of other Hungarian Jewish women were marched on foot to the Austrian labor camp. And during that march, half the Jewish women died of the cold, starvation, or execution.
Is this the march? Is this the picture depicting part of the march?
Yes, this is what they collected when they collected all the women in October. This is the march. You may see some teenage boys in shorts there because all the men were already gone. All the men, like my father, they were all in Jewish labor camps all over the world. So only the women, mostly by and large, not all, because my aunts survived somehow with my grandparents. But yes, that's the picture when they marched them. First, they marched them into a brick factory where they collected tens and thousands of them. And then from the brick factory, they marched them on foot to Austria.
Do you recall what it was like to have the Soviet soldiers liberate Hungary? We've heard so many stories about the Russian occupiers, the Russian liberators. What a brutal experience that was to be liberated by the Soviets. Do you remember what that was like?
No, I don't remember it, but I know the stories. I can tell you what I experienced as a child and what I saw. And but I certainly heard about a lot of terrible things, how the Russians were raping women and doing all kinds of things. But I can tell you what I remember. As I told you, on January 18, in the building that we lived in, a single room, 7 or 8 of us, all sleeping on the floor. All the windows, 2 windows were all, glass was broken, so you could hear everything that was going outside. And that morning, suddenly everything went eerily quiet, and nobody understood what was going on. So my grandparents, my aunts, and my older cousins, they all got up, rushed to the window to see what was going on. And I said, somebody picked me up, because I wanted to see what was going on. So somebody picked me up, took me to the window. And as we looked out, this was inside the ghetto now. As we looked out to the right, we could see some soldiers coming in a street toward our building. But they looked totally different than the Arrow Cross soldiers or Nazi SS soldiers. These were the Russian soldiers liberating the ghetto. And the next thing I heard was screaming and yelling as people were rushing out of the buildings toward the soldiers, yelling a word that I didn't know what it meant. It was "chleb, chleb, chleb," which is the Russian word for bread. As I told you, everybody was dying. People were dying like flies by January 1945, mostly of starvation or the cold or sickness. So everybody wanted bread. That was the first thing that came out of their mouth.
Wow.
Later on, I had another interesting experience with a Russian soldier, because we moved back into my grandparents' apartment at the day after liberation. My grandfather carried me on his back. And after a week or so, I was able to get on my feet. And one day, one of my aunts, took me with her to gather some wood. Remember, Budapest was bombed. 60% of Budapest was destroyed, all the buildings and so forth. So it looked like many of the pictures you saw from World War II in Berlin and other big European cities. So I went with Aunt Clary to gather wood, and she found a store that was bombed out, and there was wood in there. So she started gathering up the wood, and all of a sudden another woman showed up and started screaming at my aunt, saying, "Hey, this is my store. This is my wood. Don't take it." And the next thing I saw was the two women started to fight each other for a scrap of wood. And I turned around and I saw a Russian soldier sitting there on some rubble with his uh, gun on his back, smoking a cigarette, watching these two women and having a good laugh. For him, this was entertainment. And that's the only clear experience I had with Russian soldiers.
That's a wow.
Of course, I had a lot of experience later on, because the Russians liberated us, but they forgot to leave. And as you know, they stayed there until 1989, and the Iron Curtain finally fell.
Do we have any other questions out there? Anybody who has a question for Bob?
Yeah.
Wants more information about an aspect of his story?
Somebody spoke up.
Bob, let me ask you about the Hungarian fascists. You are obviously too young to remember when they came to power, but can you give us a little bit of a history lesson about who they were?
Yeah. The fascists, there was a party long before uh, World Wars. I'm not sure exactly when that party started, but probably in the late 30s or early 40s, called the Arrow Cross Party. And their symbol, look, here's the picture of what the Arrow Cross Party looked like. And all you have to do is take a look at it. And as you know, the saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. I don't have to explain the sympathy of the Hungarian Arrow Cross to the German Nazis. Look at the swastika. This party was the most virulently anti-Semitic party in Hungary. They were illegal until early 1944 when the Germans invaded Hungary. The first thing they did was they made the Arrow Cross Party a legal party. And that's when they were then roaming around and trying to gather Jews and take them to the Danube, shoot them and dump them into the icy river. There's a beautiful memorial on the Danube to this event. If any of you ever goes to Budapest, you have to look at it. It's very well recognized, and almost all Budapest is now a big international city, and all the tourists go to see this memorial. It's called the Shoe Memorial, with a lot of shoes along the Danube, where hundreds and thousands, maybe even thousands of Hungarian Jews were killed by dumping them into the river. So what happened was, in October of 1944, when the end was clear to all the Nazis, they knew that the war was over. The Germans in Hungary knew that they had lost the war. They were trying to escape somehow or other. And they decided to put the Arrow Cross Party in charge of the government. And they asked the Arrow Cross Party to finish the job of liquidating the remaining Jews who were not deported in the early summer of 1944 to Dachau, or not to Dachau, but to Auschwitz. So that's when a lot of the crimes took place. And they were just roaming around in the city. And if you didn't have the right papers, they just take you. If you were lucky, they maybe put you into the big ghetto, because the plan was to eventually blow up the ghetto. It was too late to transport 70,000 or 100,000 Jews out of Hungary. There were no trains. The Allies weren't bombing anything at that time, and the Germans had no staff, no trains to take that many people and deport them. So the idea was to mine the ghetto and blow it up. And they were planning on doing that. The only reason it didn't happen because Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat, discovered the plan and threatened the German who was in charge, the Nazi German was in charge of that. He told him that we know who you are, and if you go ahead, you are going to pay the price for that. And so we averted getting blown up. But that's when October was the worst part of the what I would call killing of the Jews, because the Arrow Cross Party was now in total control of Budapest. And that's when Eva's grandfather, the only victim of the Holocaust, was killed. He went out to find some bread one day and never showed up. And it was just presumed that he was caught and he didn't have the right papers, and they took him to the Danube, shot him, and dumped him into the river. So that was the short, very short, but very bloody era of the Arrow Cross Party in Hungary in the close to the very end of the war. You know, everybody knew that the Allies are going to win the war, but to these Arrow Cross thugs, it was more important to kill Jews as long as they could, even at the risk of risking their lives, because many of them, I know this for a fact, were found later on, and many of them were tried and some of them were hung for their crimes. In fact, I just recently participated in an animated short movie that was created in Hungary, in Budapest, about these very, very last months of 1944. And they asked me to participate by narrating part of my story. That's part of the short that's being shown around Europe right now. And last thing I heard was that they just submitted that short to the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival. So I already seen the short, of course, but it may get some wider publicity in Atlanta.
Boy, I would love to see that short.
Yeah.
You know, Bob, I ran across this photograph that reminded me kind of a story that I'm not sure you shared all of the story here. I'm familiar with the story about your cousin. This is a photograph from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum website, portrait of a Hungarian Jew dressed in the uniform of the Arrow Cross. And you kind of makes you scratch your head, like, why would this Jewish guy have the Arrow Cross armband? But it reminded me of a story that you tell in your book about your cousin.
Yes, that's exactly. He was probably had some false IDs, or maybe not even have any IDs, and trying to survive by having armband. The story you're referring to is my cousin Mike, who lived with us in my grandparents. He was the older son of my Aunt Piri. The younger one was Tom. Mike was, as I said, I think I did say earlier, that it was Mike's job to go out and without his yellow star, day and night, and go into bombed out buildings and stores and look for anything that had value, maybe some watch or jewelry or anything that he could then take and barter for food. And then he would bring this food back to us to survive on. So Mike was clearly one of my heroes. He was the lady who took me to my grandparents' place after my mother was taken away, one of my heroes. My grandfather, who somehow managed to get, it's another long story that I couldn't even try to explain to you because it's so complicated. It's in the book about how he managed to get Schutzpasses, Swedish Schutzpasses for us, except for two of them, for my grandfather and my grandmother. And subsequently, they were actually taken away to be deported because of that. But he made sure that I had a Schutzpass as a 6-year-old child. And Mike clearly was another one of my heroes. I don't know how we would have survived without Mike. And I got to know Mike. I lost track after the war. We haven't seen each other for decades. And we reconnected in Sydney, Australia in 2005 when I was writing my story down after my grandson was born in 2002, as I said earlier. And Mike and I sat down at his kitchen table. I had my tape recorder with me, and he would tell me, he remembered everything. He remembered street names. He remembered almost day to day what happened to our group, how we had to run from one building to the next, always trying to be a step ahead of the Arrow Cross. Typically, the Arrow Cross would come into these buildings and demand that all the Jews go down to the courtyard and show their Schutzpasses. And if they didn't like you, or you didn't have enough money to bribe them, the lucky ones were taken into the big ghetto, and the unlucky ones were taken to the Danube, shot and dumped into the river. And so what happened was Mike one day found an Arrow Cross armband, just like the one you showed on the picture before. And he didn't know what to do with it, put it in his pocket. And then he came back to our building one day and he discovered that two Arrow Cross men, one a very old guy and a very young teenager with guns on their back, were ordering all the Jews around the courtyard to show their Schutzpasses. And Mike decided, he was very quick-minded, he decided to pull out his Arrow Cross armband, put it on his arm, And he told the old man, he says, "Hey, these are my Jews. I'll take care of them." And according to Mike, the old guy looked at him, looked at his arrow cross arm, and he said, "Okay, you take care of them. Just
Wow.
make sure they don't cheat you." Those were the last words. The reference to cheating was, of course, the idea that these Jews probably have more money than they'll tell you or they give you.
Right.
But that's how Mike saved us one time with the arrow cross.
Bob, you mentioned that your family never talked about the Holocaust. Is that because it's just too painful?
I don't know. It was just wasn't. It's no different than the veterans of World War II or other wars. You know, some soldiers who come back and saw their buddies killed next to them and saw terrible things. And many of them I know from my experience weren't willing to talk about it for years and years. And sometimes they needed psychological help. You know, we even gave a name to this post-traumatic stress disorder,
Right.
PTSD. Well, in 1944, we didn't know there was such a thing as PTSD. We didn't have psychiatrists. We didn't have psychologists. Nobody cared about the Jews, to be honest with you. Hungary suffered a lot. It was totally destroyed. And many Hungarians, about 300,000 Hungarians out of 10 million, were killed. Now, that's a very small percentage compared to 75% of the Jews who were killed. But still, the environment was such, especially under the communist regime, they really didn't want to care. They didn't want to talk about the Holocaust. The communists didn't want to talk about what happened to the Jews. They wanted to talk about the fact that they were the liberators, that they were the heroes of World War II. So this whole thing about the Holocaust, the World Holocaust itself didn't exist. I didn't even hear about it until decades later. So I can only tell you one personal experience that happened when I was already living in Atlanta. And I brought my Uncle Lotzi out for a vacation with his wife and we went to Hilton Head for a nice vacation. And my uncle and I were sitting under an umbrella and looking over the ocean, the women. I think I was just there by myself, but his wife was there, was taking a nap. And I approached my uncle and I asked him to tell me what happened to him during his being in a Jewish slave camp. And he started to talk, but he couldn't finish the second sentence. He just completely broke down. And then I got help from his wife because I brought up the subject. So we just didn't talk about it. It wasn't denial. Everybody knew what happened. But we were not able to deal with it. We couldn't bring it out, discuss it, and have a session with others and talk about common experiences. I didn't talk about it for 60 years until I wrote my story down and accidentally or inadvertently, where I was reluctant, I should say, reluctantly agreed to speak about it for the first time in 2010. That was 11 years ago. I never spoke about it. They're my best friends in Atlanta, Jews and non-Jews, known me since we lived here. I was a member of a Jewish country club, and I had 40, 50 friends. I was a big tennis player and played golf. Nobody ever asked me a question. The idea, they didn't even think about asking about the Holocaust. They didn't know, they didn't realize that I was a survivor. So this is just fairly recent that I decided to try to talk about it. And then I discovered that I'm actually teaching a lesson to the children, to the students, and to grown-ups about the Holocaust. And I studied all the genocides of the 20th century. and I was looking for a common element, that thread that goes through all these genocides, because the Holocaust was just one of 20 some genocides of the 20th century. It wasn't even the largest one. Biggest one was probably the Chinese genocide of Mao Zedong. And the second one was Stalin's in the Ukraine, the Holodomor, called it the Ukrainian, called it the Holodomor. There more people were killed than during the Holocaust. And then there were many others in every continent in the world, and all these countries, different nationalities. So the only thing I could find common among all these genocides is that not a single genocide took place in a liberal democracy. So that told me something. And I'm trying to tell that to children, to students and grown-ups, that we must maintain democracy, freedom, in order to have liberty, in order to avoid genocide. And that's the real story.
That's a very, very good explanation.
Bob, Rick asks, can you talk about becoming a U.S. citizen?
Well, I was going to go back to Canada after I finished MIT, and I probably would have gone back and probably would now be a Canadian citizen, and who knows where I would have ended up in the world. But because I got married to Eva, who was by then, 1963, was living, she got her green card. After she finished high school in Montreal, she came to join her parents, who immigrated to the US on a special deal, because her father was a skilled tool and die maker. And back in those days, in the 1950s, we still had an industry called tool and where you needed tool and die makers. No, today that's gone, because all these things are being made somewhere else. So Eva got her green card, and the rule is that if you marry someone who has a green card, you are also eligible to get a green card. So I got my green card in 1964, the year after we got married. And I realized that although I got an offer to go back to Canada to teach at the very same university where I was going at night. But to be honest with you, I couldn't afford it, because I could make almost 50% more in the US with my MIT diplomas than I could in Canada. So I decided to stay in America, and I got my citizenship in 1969, and enjoyed it ever since then.
Very good. How many children do you have, Bob?
I have a boy and a girl. My son is 57 years old, and my daughter is 55. They're both truly American kids. My son was born in Boston, and my daughter was born in Philadelphia. I don't think you can be any more American than that. Boston and Philadelphia.
How many grandchildren?
I have just only two grandchildren. I would have liked more, but we only got two. Both of them are in college at UGA. One is a senior, coming now a senior, and the other one is a sophomore. Two very nice, young, very smart kids, and we have a lot of fun with them. I bonded with them when they were very small. I taught them a lot of things. I taught them how to swim, how to play tennis, how to hit a golf ball, all the things that I could do to spend time with them. So
how did your grandchildren react to the book?
I'm sorry?
How did the grandchildren react to your book?
Well, I didn't give it to them until, remember, I wrote these after the second one was born, started writing. And I knew this was a book that they needed to be more mature in order to really understand what I'm trying to tell them in the book. So they didn't get the book until they were 13 years old. That was my bar mitzvah present to them. But they have heard many of my speeches about the Holocaust. They knew who I am. They know their history. They know their background. So I'm very grateful for that.
Ben Wright, you have a question.
Yes, Mr. Ratonyi, I just wanted to thank you for sharing your story with us this evening. So good to hear from you. I very vividly remember the uprising in Budapest in '56 was on the news. Of course, the news was on there about the closure of Suez Canal as well, but it was, so considered. What an act of bravery and courage and a glimmer of hope for people in the U.S. That was coming from behind the Iron Curtain. And I'm pleased to hear your story. I've heard from a number of Holocaust survivors from Germany, Poland, France, and Czechoslovakia, but never from Hungary. So you've really given us a treat by being willing to share your story with us. So just thank you so much.
Well, you're quite welcome. And indeed, the Hungarian uprising was such a great opportunity for America to break the Iron Curtain right then in 1956. As we all know, or we all learned later on, decades later, the Soviet Union was a paper tiger. They had a military, but their economy was in ruins. They export, all these socialist satellite countries had to export the best goods, the best stuff that was produced to Russia in order for them to have a decent life. So if there was the will and a coalition of Western powers, Hungary was free. We even had a person come to New York and to the UN, and we were begging for help. And I read about it extensively, and unfortunately, the State Department back then and ever since then, and even before that, was highly anti-Jewish. And they didn't want Jews in immigrants. They didn't want Jewish immigrants. And some of you may have heard of the stories during the Holocaust that a ship showed up on the shores of America full of Jews, and we would not let them land. And Eisenhower was convinced by some of his advisors, and many of them were anti-Semites, and that included a lot of names that I could mention. So Hungary was not that important. No, I must admit, there was a risk. The risk was a nuclear confrontation because the Russians had a nuclear bomb. But knowing what I know now, I have a feeling that if America stepped up to the test and was, used its leverage and power and showed up immediately with military support while the border was open and even renamed the country, we had a new flag and everything, a new parliament, the communists were thrown out of the parliament, etc. It could have changed history. That didn't happen. And who paid the price for that? All these socialist countries that had to wait another almost 50 years of communism they had to endure before 1989, when the Iron Curtain fell. So there was a great opportunity, but unfortunately it didn't happen.
Bob, where can we find your book?
You can find the book just about everywhere. It's available in Amazon, on Barnes and Noble, Google, iTunes, and the other day I discovered that it was even on Walmart. So all you have to do is go online and put in either my name, not Reichman. That way you won't find it. You have to put in Ratonyi, spell it right, and it will show up in the books. You'll see it right away, and it's available.
And I have put the link to the Amazon site here on the Zoom side and on the Facebook side. What a wonderful evening. Thank you, Pete, and thank you, Bob. I see that we're a little past 8:30, but I do want to, before we sign off here, I want to introduce you, Bob, to Connor Ritchie. He's 16 years old. He's in Lafayette, Louisiana. He's been hanging with you the whole time, listening to your story. He's a high school student. I know that he just drinks in this history having to do with World War II. And Connor, thank you for joining us. Connor makes it a practice, Bob, you'll find this interesting, of calling World War II veterans on the phone and interviewing them over, a series of conversations. I think he's up to 23 World War II veterans he's interviewed. And before we sign off, we've been having him share information about one of the veterans that he has interviewed lately. And Connor, you spoke with P-38 pilot Jim Kunkel, right? Recently.
Yes, I interviewed him about a few days ago, and I spoke to him today. He's doing pretty well. He still flies at 98, by the way.
He still flies.
Still flies.
Yeah, at 98. He'll be 99 in October.
Is he still flying that P-38?
I don't think so.
Here's a picture of him. And can you tell us a little bit about his service?
Sure, why not? He started being interested in aviation. It takes him well back as a kid. One of his highlights of his life is meeting Charles Lindbergh, who didn't get to spend as much time as he wanted to, but he said he was an intelligent man who was willing to serve his country. And I recently found out that he was crosswise with FDR to serve in the war, But anyways, he was a P-38 Lightning pilot, and the 370th had some very distinguished commanders. One was Seth McKee, a very close friend of Jim, who later became 4-star general, and he had lunch with him. Had lunch with him a few years ago, until he passed at 100. But anyways, he was shot down by W-190s and was burned up pretty badly. And he doesn't remember too much, but he said he was against 20 German fighters, and he was getting tangled by German fighters constantly. And one of them must have hit the fuel tank, and it was like a blowtorch, he said. It just exploded and badly burned his arm, his neck, and all that. He had crutches and all that. And he even tried to get into the squadron, but the doctor didn't like the way he was walking, so he sent him back to the hospital. And that's where he met the 1st Infantry Division regimental colonel and became close friends, but never found him until he found out that the colonel was buried in Oregon.
And he also, Jim Kunkel also got to know Hoyt Vandenberg, who is the commander of the 9th Air Force in World War II and later went on to become other things.
Yes, he knew Vandenberg. He served under Vandenberg. Matter of fact, he met him at one time during his Air Force career. He said that Vandenberg was a good general, a great guy, and he was a 2-star and later became 4-star general. He was 2 stars when he met him.
Wow.
And here's a picture of Vandenberg here with other elite generals in World War II. Wow. Yeah. What an amazing thing that you're doing, Connor, talking to these World War II veterans. And I would hope and I would suggest that you might find it interesting to add maybe Holocaust survivors to your list, because boy, their stories are chilling and fascinating also.
Connor needs to get in touch with me too, Todd.
Oh, I will put you in touch with, I'm warning you, Connor, once you get sucked into Pete's orbit, you ain't ever coming out. He's somebody who has a passion for veteran stories, just like you do and just like I do. Thank you, Pete, for introducing Bob to us. Thank you, Connor, for joining us tonight. And thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you very much, sir. It was my honor to hear your story again.
Thanks guys for listening to my story. Have a wonderful evening.
It was. Thank you so much.
Good
night,
evening,
everybody.
Good evening, everybody. We'll see you Monday night. Take care.